Alright, I know it seems a bit unusual for me to talk about a game so recent as this, mostly because I prefer talking about games long after their release so updates and more in-depth knowledge and analysis can happen, but I feel that Absolution, besides being somewhat topical, serves as a striking example for many of the topics I wanted to eventually cover in this little series of mine. It's rare indeed when I hold such strong opinions about a modern game, especially so early into its life, but Absolution is one of those delightful exceptions. So, if you will, allow me to do an impromptu Let's Dissect that's less fully developed than it would be under different circumstances. I've been a big fan of the Hitman series, at least from Contracts onward, and Blood Money, the fourth installment, is one of my all-time favorite stealth games despite the fact that I could criticize that game at numerous points. I mention that to put this video, and really all of Let's Dissect past, present, and future into context. It is often the case that I can be very critical about certain aspects of a game yet still like it overall, or at least get some enjoyment out of it, because it's very rare for me to unequivocally enjoy any game. Absolution is a game in that mixed bag category. I think it's decent, or at least that it has its moments, from what I've played so far, but I'm about to lay into it with my criticisms. Because Absolution unquestionably broke tradition. You'll often find opinions of this installment in the completely hate it camp and the completely love it camp. Even though it might not seem like it because I'm going to emphasize certain things, I'm really more towards the middle. While it's probably not the thing most would notice first, a thing that's always very noticeable for me is checklists for challenges. You see, ever since I started seeing these pop up in games, I've had mixed feelings about them as they're often a double-edged sword. On one hand, there are many times where such lists make me realize something is possible that I had no idea was possible, such as doing a special jump from a horse to a beam in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. On the other hand, these often completely destroy any joy you might get from exploring and finding things out for yourself. Essentially, they're like a spoiler that you can't avoid if you don't want to because it's integrated into the game itself. Additionally, particularly bad instances don't just remove joy of exploration and discovery, but even go so far as to trivialize it, such as doing a special jump from a horse to beam 20 times for no reason in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. A perfect example of this in Absolution can be seen as early as the King of Chinatown, the first real mission. In that mission, it's not only possible to discreetly poison the king, it's actually possible to do it in at least 3 different ways. The positive I took from finding that out through the mastery checklist is that I had no idea that poisoning was possible at all, because the previously standard poison syringe was removed from this installment, and because I felt an alternative was not obvious unless you specifically knew what you were looking for. Even when I learned of the possibility of poisoning, I didn't even know where to find the fugu fish until I looked it up in a guide, and I'm not sure whether that's my fault for not exploring enough, or the designers' fault for not making it stand out more. The negative I took from that same experience is that there wasn't much joy in actually enacting the poisoning, since I didn't really have a hand in their discovery. The best analogy I can think of is when somebody explains a joke you don't get. You may get it after the explicit answer, but you don't necessarily appreciate it as much as you would if you figured it out for yourself. Know what I mean? It's one thing when the player chooses to spoil things for themselves, it's another when the game pretty much actively encourages mental laziness by telling you what all is possible. Now, I get that sometimes it's just hints, but other times I still think a decent amount of the game is spoiled for you in these checklists. I suppose it's just developers wanting to ascertain that the work they put into these possibilities doesn't get squandered by players failing to recognize them, as well as them taking pride in how varied strategies for a successful play can be, but to me it seems to be increasing designer happiness at the expense of player happiness. You know, just read this article by Yatzia on a similar subject, and I think it excellently explains why this sort of thing might be happening and why I think it's a problem. By and large, I find the scoring system begrudgingly acceptable, but the devil's in the details on this one. You see, I'm of the opinion that accidents, as introduced in Blood Money, were pretty much the highest form of kill, especially when an accident could be executed whilst you were physically far away from your target. To me, that seems like establishing a strong alibi, something that I think is great for stealthy play. However, in Absolution, so far I've found that accidents generally seem to be worth fewer points than other methods, such as fiber wire or a quick pistol headshot. Accidents can still be sufficient for Silent Assassin, the highest ranking and the one that usually corresponds to high quality stealthy play, but because of the particulars of the scoring, I've gotten irked. Accidents being worth less than another method, often because they're not as silent, makes me feel that the game is judging me more harshly than I would like. Okay, sure, you're a silent assassin, but true silent assassins get up close and personal with wire. As such, you're only going to get an A-. A good chunk of this opinion is based off of the perception that accidents truly were the highest form of kill in Blood Money, because even if a body was found, it couldn't be traced back to you. Granted, accidents in Blood Money could get absurd fairly easily, but that's a flaw in that game's execution of the concept, not in the concept itself. Checklists and scoring are comparatively minor annoyances though in the face of the thing that bothers me most about this installment, the new disguise system. Now, before you jump down my throat about realism and all that, I perfectly understand the desire to reduce the effectiveness of disguises from previous games. I definitely think the case could be made that disguises in earlier games, especially in Blood Money, greatly reduced challenge by granting you basically unimpeded exploratory capabilities in levels provided that you could find the disguise with the greatest success available there, and provided that you didn't do anything overly suspicious like carry around an inappropriate weapon. I think the huge benefit of disguises in that game is why players have since devised adding conditions like suit only to their pro/silent assassin playthroughs of the game, as well as why suit only challenges exist in Absolution. While I feel I understand the intent of the new disguise system, let me explain how I feel it fails in execution. My biggest gripe is that suspicion happens so easily and from such distances that often just remaining in your suit isn't that different from being in a disguise. The exception is that the rarest disguises, for example the Terminus Janitor, can still provide that walk all over without being bothered experience from earlier games. However, in Absolution, these super disguises lack the potential to be seen through at any given time as in earlier games. You see, on higher difficulties in earlier games, you pretty much had to stay out of the line of sight of guards, because if you hung around for more than a few seconds, they'd get suspicious, and your disguise would start to crumble and eventually break if you didn't get away fast. There was more leeway for target stalking and level exploration than in Absolution, but disguises definitely weren't invulnerable either. Additionally, I'd like to add that I think Absolution's disguise effectiveness system seems completely backwards at times. Why is it that the rarest disguises are the ones that are the least noticeable? You'd think very distinguishable disguises like the dealer in Chinatown, who the king should personally know by the way, would be blown almost instantly since people could be more likely to recognize the differences for unique individuals. On the flip side, very common disguises like police uniforms seem like they should go unnoticed, or at least less noticed, at least for a while, since the appearance of individuals blend together when the uniform they wear is so commonly seen. The argument I often see in favor of the new disguise system is that people or employees of the same group should better recognize other members of the group when compared to the outgroup. That's perfectly understandable for small, close-knit groups, but can officers or another populated group really memorize and immediately recognize the entire force they're working with? Personal friends, VIPs, etc. is understandable, and that was even played around with in earlier games, but knowing entire groups? That seems silly. The newly introduced instinct and blending systems alleviate things somewhat because they feel included and designed to give a higher margin of error for this sort of thing, but instinct is so limited on higher difficulties that it's basically like it's not even there. I'll end my criticisms on something minor but still notable. I find it very odd that in this installment, 47 can conceal pretty much any weapon with minimal effort. In earlier games, requiring special circumstances for concealing large weapons seemed to make so much more sense. Logically, you can't just shove big and bulky things in your coat and hope to go unnoticed. And in terms of game balance, if you wanted to use the big guns for big power, you'd have to use a little finesse. Those who resorted to shotguns and SMGs probably didn't care much for finesse, but at least sniper rifles required some inventory management if you wanted range but also still wanted to remain stealthy. I felt it was implemented in a very natural and sensible way in previous games, so I was surprised that all of this was thrown out the window for, honestly, I have no idea why. Moving on. Now, where's that middle ground I was talking about? Though I've criticized a lot, I definitely do enjoy some things in Absolution. In an industry polluted by overemphasis on mass appeal and designing things such that no idiot is left behind, I must say I respect IO for spending some time and resources on developing the purest difficulty mode and other related bits and bobs. One thing I really like is that additional patrols and stationary guards are added on higher difficulties. I know that such doesn't only happen on purest, but it feels most important there as that's where you have the least amount of leeway and guidance. It is often significantly easier to do certain things on lower difficulties, but I find that Purist requires you to get crafty and specific and refined with your strategies in order to succeed to the highest degrees. It may seem strange to you that I praise Purist mode since by and large it's probably nothing more than toggling some flags that control HUD elements, but I like how it's packaged here in Absolution. I mean, you could totally get a similar immersive experience in games like Assassin's Creed or Grand Theft Auto, but there it felt more like an afterthought on customization rather than something that might actually be sought out by a certain subset of players. I think Absolution was designed with more mass appeal in mind, but it's nice that fans of previous games were still thrown a bone. It's a pleasant mix of revolution and evolution. In my opinion, one of the best additions was the arrest/shoot-to-kill system. Blood Money sort of had something similar going on with its trespassing system, but unfortunately players could easily exploit the AI, and it was all in all admittedly rudimentary. I feel Absolution did a good job skirting around those problems. If you're caught doing something suspicious but not too violent, guards will initially try to non-lethally arrest you so long as you don't run. You can't actually be arrested a la something like Grand Theft Auto, but it can lead to a sequence where you take a human shield and then decide how to proceed from there. Even though I prefer never getting into such situations to begin with, it's nice to know that the game is flexible before slamming into a red alert. And if you're good and lucky, it's possible to quickly hide or do damage control on witnesses to calm things down. The buffer between characters being oblivious and murderous is appreciated. I also like all interactions, both new and updated, involving hands, and I think they're all a noticeable improvement over previous games. I felt that the fist-fighting QTEs, though somewhat unfitting in a stealth-oriented game, were at least implemented well for what they are. A commenter pointed out why he felt that the melee takedowns and point-shooting analogs in the earlier Splinter Cell Conviction didn't work as well as in Absolution, and I must say that I agree and that he put it quite eloquently. Besides that, dragging bodies now feels less glitchy and weird. Bodies definitely seem to have a more realistic sense of bone structure and weight to them, and though it's ultimately a minor thing, I think it does wonders for the game's verisimilitude. Also, though the AI still has its quirks, I really like that it's now smart enough to have more self-preservation. Enemies shooting at you can take cover and even change their firing positions to throw you off track. Not only that, but they'll even lay down suppressive fire, and they generally seem adverse to suicidal charges. All in all, tackling the AI on higher difficulties definitely feels like a solid threat now, rather than something that can be dealt with in easy and boring ways. Speaking of AI, I like that NPCs definitely feel more humanized in this game. The improved graphical fidelity and more detailed animations, alongside significantly more NPC chatter, does wonders to make characters feel more sympathetic, even though this isn't a role-playing game and character death ultimately matters little to you beyond point modifications. I've never enjoyed indiscriminate murder in games, especially in stealth games, but the effort put into Absolution's NPCs really makes me put in an extra effort to avoid disturbing them if I can. In fact, I feel the game suffers by sometimes explicitly challenging you to off guards in specific ways. Why dilute the stealth and all the work put into the humanization? And though I prefer the quieter, melee-focused approaches to beating levels, shooting in general feels massively improved from earlier games. 47 can take cover, pop in and out to fire and reload, steady his aim, and even blind fire. Shooting generally felt so rudimentary in previous games that I didn't even think the developers would be so brazen as to include a concept like blind fire in this installment. Does this increased effectiveness of gunplay impact the game's stealth-oriented nature? While I feel that could be said for Splinter Cell Conviction, a previously mentioned game with many similar mechanics, I feel that Absolution skirts around that by actively punishing you via point deductions for getting too careless. I think it's undeniable that this game feels more action-oriented at times, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that the series has completely abandoned its stealth roots just yet. Mangled them a bit, perhaps, but it definitely hasn't cut them out completely. And that's something to rejoice when you consider that installments in the stealth and survival horror genres seem to be rare and rarer in non-indie releases. And that's some of my initial thoughts on Hitman Absolution. Now, it's entirely possible that, by the time you view this game may have been updated to alleviate the biggest issues I brought up with overly sensitive disguises and with the rudimentary contracts multiplayer mode. Whether or not that's applicable, I wanted to examine my experiences with and my opinions on the early version of the game for the case study it provided. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.